David was 32 years old and felt like life was passing him by. Every morning he woke up at 5, put on his work boots and headed to construction sites where he spent his days carrying heavy materials, mixing cement, and trying to make ends meet. His hands were rough, his back ached, and his bank account was always running on empty. But the loneliness hurt more than any physical pain. His friends from high school had all moved on. They had families now, kids who called them daddy, and homes filled with laughter. David would see their pictures online and feel a deep emptiness inside. He had tried dating locally, but nothing ever worked out. The women he met either wanted someone with more money, more stability, or they just didn't feel that spark. After a while, he stopped trying. It seemed easier to just accept that maybe companionship wasn't meant for him. One evening, after another long day at work, David was scrolling through his phone when an advertisement popped up. It showed beautiful women from different countries, all supposedly looking for serious relationships with American men. The website promised genuine connections, real love, and a chance at happiness. David knew these international marriage agencies had a reputation, and not always a good one. But something made him click on the link. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just desperation. He created a profile, feeling slightly embarrassed as he typed out his basic information. Construction worker. Lives alone. Looking for someone to build a life with. Within days, messages started coming in. Dozens of them. Women from Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America, all seemingly interested in getting to know him. It felt overwhelming but also exciting. For the first time in years, someone was paying attention to him. Then he saw her profile. Her name was Katerina, and she was 28 years old, living in a small city he had never heard of. Her pictures showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She wrote in her profile that she was tired of the men in her country, that she wanted stability and a real partner who would treat her with respect. David felt his heart skip a beat. She seemed perfect. He sent her a message, keeping it simple and honest. He told her about his work, his small apartment, and his dream of having a family someday. To his surprise, she responded within hours. Her English wasn't perfect, but her words were sweet and warm. She asked about his day, his interests, and his hopes for the future. They started chatting every evening, and David found himself rushing home from work just to talk to her, but talking wasn't free. The website charged for every message exchanged. $5 here, $10 there. It added up quickly. Then Katerina mentioned she wanted to video call him, but that required upgrading to a premium membership. Another $100. David hesitated but convinced himself it was worth it. When he finally saw her face on the screen, heard her voice, and watched her smile at him, he felt like he had found something real. The months went by, and their connection seemed to deepen. Katerina shared stories about her difficult childhood, her sick mother who needed medical care, and her struggles to make enough money in her country. David's protective instincts kicked in. He wanted to help. When she mentioned needing money for her mother's medication, he sent it without hesitation. When she said the visa application required fees she couldn't afford, he paid those too. When she needed money for English classes to prepare for life in America, he took on extra shifts to cover the cost. His savings account, which had taken him years to build, started shrinking fast. The $5,000 he had saved was now down to a few hundred. His credit cards were maxed out. But Katerina kept reassuring him that once she arrived in America, they would build a beautiful life together. She would get a job, help with expenses, and they would be a team. David believed every word because he needed to believe. His sister noticed the changes. She saw him working more, looking more tired, and talking constantly about this woman he had never met in person. She warned him to be careful, told him these situations rarely ended well, and begged him to at least slow down. But David was defensive. He accused her of being jealous, of not wanting him to be happy. They argued, and the distance between them grew. Finally, after 6 long months and nearly $8,000 spent, Katerina got her visa approved. David could barely contain his excitement. He cleaned his apartment from top to bottom, bought new sheets for the bed, and filled the fridge with food. He took a day off work and drove to the airport 3 hours early because he couldn't wait any longer. Standing at the arrival's gate, his heart pounded in his chest. He held a sign with her name on it, his hands shaking with anticipation. People poured out of the international terminal, families reuniting with tears and hugs, business travelers walking briskly with their luggage. Then he saw her. Katerina walked through the doors, pulling a large suitcase, her eyes scanning the crowd. When she spotted David, there was no running embrace, no tears of joy. She simply walked over, her expression neutral, almost cold. David's smile faltered for a moment, but he pushed the doubt aside. She must be tired from the long flight, he told himself. Jet lag does strange things to people. He reached out to hug her, but she stiffened in his arms. The warmth he had felt through the screen was nowhere to be found. During the car ride home, he tried making conversation, asking about her flight, if she was hungry, if she wanted to stop anywhere. Her answers were short and distracted. She looked out the window, her mind clearly somewhere else. When they got to his apartment, Katerina walked through the rooms with a critical eye. She didn't say it was nice or thank him for preparing everything. She just nodded and asked which room was hers. David felt confusion wash over him. Her room. He had assumed they would share the bedroom. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. She saw his expression and rolled her eyes. That night, she took the spare bedroom and closed the door without saying goodnight. David sat alone in the living room, staring at the wall, wondering what had just happened. This wasn't how he had imagined their first night together. Not even close. The next few days were even stranger. Katerina barely spoke to him except to ask for money for basic things, to complain about the apartment, or to request the Wi-Fi password so she could video call her friends back home. She spoke in her native language, laughing and animated in ways she never was with David. He felt like a stranger in his own home. Then 1 week after her arrival, they were sitting at the kitchen table eating a silent dinner when Katerina put down her fork and looked at him directly for the first time since she arrived. Her eyes were hard, her voice matter of fact. She said the words that would change everything. "You paid for me to come here. Now do what you promised. Marry me so I can stay." David felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. There was no pretense anymore, no sweet words or false promises. She laid it out plain and simple. This was a transaction, and he had already paid his part. Now it was time to deliver. The wedding happened 3 weeks later. David had hoped to wait, to give them time to actually get to know each other in person, to build some kind of real connection. But Katerina was insistent. Every day she reminded him that her visa had a time limit, that they needed to get married soon to start the green card process, that this was what he had agreed to when he brought her here. His sister refused to come to the ceremony. She told David he was making the biggest mistake of his life, that he was being used and that he would regret this. They had a terrible argument over the phone and she hung up in tears. David felt torn apart inside, but he was too deep into this situation to back out now. He had spent thousands of dollars, made promises, and brought Katerina halfway around the world. How could he just abandon everything now? The courthouse wedding was depressing. The room was small and cold with fluorescent lights that made everything look gray. David wore the only suit he owned, which was slightly too tight because he had gained weight from stress eating. Katerina wore a simple white dress she had bought at a discount store, her face showing no emotion whatsoever. There were no guests, no flowers, no celebration. Just a tired judge who read the legal words quickly, had them sign papers, and declared them married in less than 10 minutes. When the judge said David could kiss his bride, Katerina turned her cheek, offering him nothing more than that. He kissed her cheek awkwardly while the courthouse photographer snapped a single photo for their records. In that picture, which David would later keep hidden in a drawer, his face showed forced hope while hers showed complete indifference. They went home after stopping for fast food because Katerina said she was hungry. They ate burgers in the car in silence, and David tried not to think about how different this was from every wedding he had ever attended. No reception, no dancing, no joy. Just two people bound together by legal documents and unspoken resentment. Life after the wedding was even harder than before. Now that Katerina had what she needed, she didn't even pretend anymore. She stayed in her separate bedroom, spent her days taking English classes that David paid for, and went exploring the city with new friends she had made in those classes. She never invited David along. When he came home from work exhausted and dirty, she would be getting ready to go out, dressed nicely, makeup done, looking beautiful in a way she never bothered to look for him. David worked double shifts to keep up with all the expenses. The immigration process wasn't cheap. There were lawyers to pay, government fees, and endless paperwork that required professional help. On top of that, Katerina had expensive tastes. She wanted nicer clothes, better food, and complained constantly about the apartment being too small and outdated. David's credit card debt grew larger every month. He stopped checking his bank account because seeing the numbers made him feel sick. His co-workers started noticing changes in him. He looked tired all the time, lost weight because he was skipping meals to save money, and seemed distracted on the job. One of his friends at work pulled him aside and asked if everything was okay at home. David lied and said everything was fine. He felt too ashamed to admit the truth. How could he explain that his wife barely spoke to him, that she treated him like an inconvenient roommate rather than a husband, that he had made such a terrible mistake? 3 months into the marriage, David decided to leave work early one day. He had been feeling sick, probably from exhaustion and stress, and his supervisor told him to go home and rest. He expected the apartment to be empty since Katerina usually spent afternoons at school or out with friends. But when he opened the door, he heard her voice coming from her bedroom. She was laughing, really laughing, in a way he had never heard before. The sound was bright and genuine, filled with happiness. He stood in the hallway, confused, and listened. She was video calling someone, speaking rapidly in her own language. He couldn't understand most of the words, but he didn't need to. The tone said everything. She was talking to someone she loved. David's hands started shaking. He pulled out his phone and opened a translation app, then moved closer to her door, which was slightly open. He held up his phone, letting it catch her words. The translation was rough and choppy, but enough words came through to destroy him completely. "I miss you so much. This is just temporary. Once I get my papers, we can be together. He doesn't matter." The man on the other end said something, and Katerina laughed again. Yes, I know. 2 years and I'm free. Then I come back or you come here." David felt like his world was ending. He backed away from the door, grabbed his keys, and left the apartment. He drove around for hours, not knowing where to go or what to do. Everything made sense now. The coldness, the distance, the complete lack of any affection or even basic kindness. She had someone else. She had always had someone else. This entire thing from the very beginning had been a lie. When he finally returned home late that night, Katerina was in the kitchen making tea. She looked at him with mild annoyance, probably irritated that he hadn't been there to make dinner. David stood in the doorway and told her what he had heard. For a moment she looked caught, almost afraid. But then her expression hardened. She set down her cup and crossed her arms. She didn't apologize. She didn't try to deny it. Instead, she turned it back on him. "What did you think this was?" she asked coldly. "You found me on a website where women look for green cards and men look for young wives. Did you really believe I fell in love with you through a computer screen? You knew what this was. You paid thousands of dollars for me to be here. This was always a business arrangement." David felt his anger rising. "You told me you wanted a real marriage. You said you wanted a partner, a family, a future together." She shrugged. "I told you what you wanted to hear. That's how this works. You got what you paid for. A wife on paper. Someone who can file immigration documents with you. I never promised you love. Then why did you agree to marry me?" "Because I need a green card," she said simply, as if explaining something to a child. "My life in my country was terrible. No opportunities, no future. This is my chance at something better. You want me to feel guilty about trying to survive?" David felt tears burning his eyes, but he refused to cry in front of her. "So what happens now?" Katerina's expression softened slightly, but not with kindness. With pity. "Now we continue as we are. We stay married for 2 years. That's what immigration requires for me to get my permanent green card. After that, we divorce and we both move on with our lives. You can find someone who actually wants to be with you, and I can start my real life here. And I'm just supposed to pay for everything. Work myself to death and pretend we're a happy couple for 2 years? That's exactly what you're supposed to do," she said firmly. "Because if you don't, if you divorce me before the 2 years or tell immigration this is fake, I get deported. And if that happens, I will make sure everyone knows you bought a bride from a foreign country. Your family, your friends, your co-workers, everyone will know what kind of man you are." It was a threat, clear and direct. David realized he was trapped. Trapped by his own choices, his own loneliness, and his own foolish hope that someone could actually love him. He walked to his bedroom, closed the door, and finally let himself cry. The next few months were the darkest period of David's life. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, working constantly to support a woman who openly despised him. His sister eventually reached out, but their relationship remained strained. She had been right about everything, and they both knew it. which made talking to her even more painful. Then, on a cold morning in November, everything changed again. David was getting ready for work when he heard a strange sound from the bathroom. Katerina was throwing up. At first, he assumed she had food poisoning or the flu. But when it happened again the next day and the day after that, a terrible thought crossed his mind. He left work during lunch, bought a pregnancy test from the pharmacy, and left it on the bathroom counter. When he came home that evening, Katerina was sitting on the couch, her face pale, the test in her hand. 2 pink lines, positive. They stared at each other in shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had been intimate exactly once in those first confusing days after she arrived, before the truth became clear. It had been awkward and uncomfortable, and they had never tried again. But once was apparently enough. Katerina's hand shook as she held the test. "This ruins everything," she whispered. She wasn't talking to David. She was talking to herself, processing how this changed her plans. Her carefully laid out timeline of 2 years and then freedom was now completely upended. David felt a strange mixture of emotions. Fear, certainly. Confusion, absolutely. But also something unexpected. A small spark of something that felt almost like hope. He was going to be a father. Despite all the mess, despite the lies and the pain, a child was coming. His child. "What do you want to do?" he asked carefully. Katerina looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I don't know. This wasn't supposed to happen. I need to think." She grabbed her phone and went to her room, closing the door firmly behind her. Over the next week, David could hear her having intense conversations in her native language, probably with the boyfriend back home. The man she actually loved. The man she had promised to return to. He wondered what they were discussing, what decisions were being made about his child without his input. Finally, Katerina came to him with her decision. "I'm keeping the baby," she announced. "But this doesn't change our arrangement. We still divorce after 2 years. David felt his jaw tighten. "That's my child too. I have a say in this." "You have a say in nothing," she snapped. "I'm the one who's pregnant." "I'm the one whose body is changing. I'm the one who has to go through this. And I'm the one paying for everything." David surprised himself with his anger. "You want to keep living here? Keep eating the food I buy? Keep going to your classes that I pay for? Then things need to change. This isn't just about you anymore. There's a baby involved now." They argued for hours, going in circles, both stubborn and scared. Finally, exhausted, David made a proposal. "Let's try. Really try. Not for us, but for this baby. A child deserves parents who at least try to make things work. Give it a real chance. If it doesn't work, fine, but at least try." Katerina was silent for a long time. David could see her thinking, calculating, weighing her options. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay, we try. But I'm not promising anything." It was the smallest agreement, barely a commitment at all. But it was something. The pregnancy was difficult. Katerina experienced terrible morning sickness that lasted all day. She was tired constantly, emotional, and even more difficult to live with than before. David found himself taking care of her despite their complicated relationship. He made her meals even when she complained about them. He drove her to doctor appointments even though she barely thanked him. He rubbed her feet when they swelled even though she never asked him to. Slowly, almost invisibly, something began to shift. It started with small moments. One evening, Katerina actually thanked him for making dinner. Another day, she asked about his work and actually listened to his answer. When they went to hear the baby's heartbeat for the first time, she grabbed his hand in the doctor's office and, for a moment, they felt like a real couple. The boyfriend back home grew frustrated with the situation. David knew this because Katerina's phone calls with him became arguments. She would shout in her language, cry after hanging up, and look lost and confused. David never asked about these calls, but he could guess what was happening. The other man didn't want to wait around for a woman who was pregnant with someone else's child. Then one day the calls stopped altogether. Katerina told David, her voice flat and tired, that her boyfriend had ended things. He had found someone else. Someone without complications. Someone who could actually be with him. She cried that night. Real tears for the first time since arriving. David found her on the couch, sobbing into a pillow, and he didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to feel victorious, to say, "See, this is what you get." But another part of him just saw a scared, pregnant woman who was far from home and alone. He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She looked at him with red, swollen eyes. Why, you should be happy. Now you get what you wanted. I never wanted you to hurt, David said honestly. I just wanted you to choose to be here, to choose us. Katerina wiped her eyes and was quiet for a while. Then she started talking, really talking, for the first time. She told him about her childhood in poverty, about a father who drank and a mother who worked 3 jobs but could never get ahead. She told him about the lack of opportunities in her small city, about friends who had escaped through marriage to foreign men, about her own desperation to find a way out. I'm not a bad person, she said softly. I just wanted a chance at a better life, and the only way I could see to get that was through marriage to someone from a wealthy country. I didn't think about your feelings. I didn't think about how it would hurt you. I only thought about surviving. David listened without judgment. For the first time, he saw her not as the villain in his story, but as a person with her own struggles and pain. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it helped him understand. We're both stuck in this situation now, he said, so maybe we can try to make the best of it. Not for some romantic fairy tale, but just to build something decent for our kid. Katerina nodded slowly. Maybe we can try. It wasn't love. It wasn't even close to love, but it was a beginning. As Katerina's belly grew, so did the fragile connection between them. David started coming home to an apartment that felt slightly less cold. Katerina began cooking occasionally, attempting dishes from both their cultures with mixed results. They would laugh together when she accidentally used salt instead of sugar, or when David burned rice so badly they had to throw out the pot. The baby's first kicks happened while they were watching TV one evening. Katerina gasped and grabbed David's hand, pressing it against her stomach. He felt the tiny thump against his palm and his eyes filled with tears. In that moment, all the pain and betrayal seemed far away. There was a little person in there, half him and half her, who would arrive soon and change everything. They decided to name her Sophie. David suggested it, and surprisingly, Katerina agreed. They spent weekends preparing the spare room as a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and assembling a crib that came with instructions neither of them could fully understand. They argued over how the pieces fit together, but they also laughed, and somehow the crib got built. His sister finally agreed to visit. She came with gifts for the baby and skepticism in her eyes. But when she saw how David had transformed and how Katerina was actually trying, her expression softened. She pulled David aside in the kitchen and hugged him tightly. I'm still worried, she whispered, but I can see you're trying to make this work. Just be careful with your heart. When Sophie was born on a rainy April morning, everything changed. The labor was long and difficult, and David stayed by Katerina's side the entire time, even when she screamed at him and blamed him for her pain. When Sophie finally arrived, tiny and red-faced and perfect, the nurse placed her in David's arms and he felt his entire world shift on its axis. This was his daughter, his child. Nothing else mattered anymore except protecting her and giving her the best life possible. For Katerina, the experience was more complicated. She held Sophie and felt love, certainly, but also overwhelming fear and sadness. Postpartum depression hit her hard in the weeks after birth. She cried for no reason, felt detached from the baby, and struggled to get out of bed most days. The hormones, the isolation, the realization that her old life was truly gone forever, all of it crashed down on her at once. David stepped up in ways he never imagined he could. He took time off work using vacation days he had been saving. He woke up for middle-of-the-night feedings, changed countless diapers, and walked Sophie around the apartment for hours when she wouldn't stop crying. When Katerina couldn't get out of bed, he brought her food and water. When she cried, he sat with her and listened. He never complained or threw her past behavior in her face. He just showed up day after day doing what needed to be done. His sister came over several times a week to help, bringing food and offering to watch Sophie so both David and Katerina could rest. She saw how hard David was working and how much he had grown. The lonely, desperate man who had ordered a bride from a website was gone, replaced by a devoted father who put his daughter's needs above everything else. Slowly, very slowly, Katerina began to emerge from the darkness. The depression didn't disappear completely, but it became more manageable. She started bonding with Sophie, finding joy in the baby's smiles and tiny fingers. She began to appreciate David in ways she never had before. This man who she had used and manipulated had stayed by her side through the hardest experience of her life. He didn't have to do that. He could have made things difficult, could have punished her for the past. but instead, he had shown her kindness. One night after Sophie was asleep, Katerina found David sitting on the couch looking exhausted. She sat down beside him, closer than she usually did. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For being a good father. For being patient with me. For not giving up." David looked at her, surprise in his eyes. "She's my daughter." "This is what fathers do." "Not all of them," Katerina said. "My father never did any of this. Most men wouldn't. But you do every single day without even thinking about it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sound of Sophie breathing through the baby monitor. For the first time since they met, the silence between them wasn't hostile or uncomfortable. It was just peaceful. "I want to tell you my real story," Katerina said suddenly. "Not the version I told you before, but the truth." And so she did. She told him about growing up in a tiny apartment with no heat in winter. About her father's violence when he drank. About her mother's endless work that still never put enough food on the table. About watching her friends get trapped in the same cycle of poverty, marrying young to violent men because there were no other options. About her desperate search for any way out, any chance at a different life. "The marriage agency seemed like my only hope," she explained. "Other girls from my city had done it and escaped. I knew it was wrong to lie to you. I knew I was using you, but I didn't see you as a real person. You were just my ticket out. I'm so ashamed of that now." David listened to everything, his heart breaking for the frightened young woman she had been. It didn't erase what she had done to him, but it helped him understand the desperation that had driven her choices. "I forgive you," he said finally. Katerina looked at him with wide eyes. "How, after everything I did to you?" "Because holding on to anger only hurts me," David said. "And because we have a daughter who deserves parents who aren't constantly at war. And maybe because I'm starting to see that we're both just people who made mistakes while trying to survive." Tears rolled down Katerina's cheeks. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," David agreed. "But I'm giving it to you anyway." Something shifted between them that night. The wall that had existed since the day she arrived began to crack. They weren't in love, not even close, but they were becoming something that might eventually turn into partners, maybe even friends. The months passed, and Sophie grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone. Katerina found a part-time job at a grocery store, wanting to contribute financially, and also to get out of the apartment and feel useful. David was proud of her for working, even though they didn't really need the money. She was trying, and that meant everything. They developed routines together. David would make coffee in the morning while Katerina fed Sophie. They would trade baby duty throughout the day, each giving the other breaks. In the evenings, they would cook dinner together, Sophie watching from her high chair, and they would talk about their days like a normal couple. Sometimes Katerina would teach David words in her language, and he would try to pronounce them while she laughed at his terrible accent. The 2-year mark approached, the date when Katerina would be eligible for her green card, the date when their original deal said they would divorce and go their separate ways. Neither of them mentioned it as it got closer. They both knew it was coming, but the reality of what it meant felt different now than it had 2 years ago. The morning of their second anniversary arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. David woke up and went to work as usual. Katerina stayed home with Sophie, playing with blocks on the living room floor. Neither of them acknowledged what day it was, both avoiding the conversation they knew they needed to have. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Katerina brought out a folder of papers and placed them on the kitchen table. Divorce documents. She had printed them weeks ago, when she first became eligible to apply for permanent residency on her own. With these papers signed, she would no longer need David to stay in the country. She would be free. They sat across from each other at the table, the papers between them like a wall. David looked at the documents but didn't reach for them. Katerina stared at her hands, her expression unreadable. "I thought I would feel relieved when this day came," Katerina said finally. "For 2 years, this was what I was waiting for. My freedom, my independence, the chance to start my real life, and you don't feel relieved?" David asked quietly. She shook her head slowly. "No, I feel scared and confused and—" She paused, struggling to find the words. "I don't want to sign these papers." David felt his heart skip a beat. "Why not?" Katerina looked up at him and there were tears in her eyes. Because somewhere in the past 2 years this stopped being fake. I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you held my hand at Sophie's first ultrasound. Maybe when you stayed up with me all night when I had that terrible fever. Maybe when I watched you sing silly songs to make our daughter laugh. But at some point this became real for me. She reached across the table and took his hand, something she rarely did. You're not the man I thought you were when I agreed to this. You're so much better. You're kind and patient and gentle. You work so hard to give us a good life. You forgave me when you had every right to hate me. You became the father I always wished I had for myself. And I think I've fallen in love with you. Not the dramatic instant kind of love from movies, but the quiet, steady kind that grows slowly when someone shows you through their actions who they really are. David felt tears running down his own face. He had waited so long to hear words like these. Through all the pain, the betrayal, the loneliness, some part of him had hoped that maybe eventually she would see him, really see him. I love you too, he said, his voice cracking. I think I've loved you since before you even arrived, when you were just words on a screen. But I also think I fell in love with the real you over these past 2 years. The woman who fights through depression to be there for her daughter. The woman who works hard even when she's exhausted. The woman who's learning to trust again after being hurt so much. You're stronger than you think you are. Katerina stood up and walked around the table. David stood too. And for the first time since she had arrived 2 years ago, they embraced with real feeling. Not the awkward, uncomfortable touches they had shared before, but a genuine hug between two people who had been through battle together and survived. I want to stay married, Katerina whispered against his shoulder. Not because of a green card, not because of an arrangement, but because I choose you. I choose this life we've built. I choose our family, are you sure? David asked. You could leave now. Be independent. Start completely over. You don't have to stay just because of Sophie. We can figure out custody arrangements. She pulled back and looked at him seriously. I'm not staying just because of Sophie. I'm staying because I want to. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing something not out of desperation or survival, but because it's what my heart wants. David cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was their first real kiss, filled with 2 years of pain and growth and hard-won love. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying and smiling at the same time. So what do we do with these? Katerina gestured to the divorce papers still sitting on the table. David picked them up and walked to the kitchen drawer where they kept important documents. He filed them away carefully. We keep them as a reminder of where we started and how far we've come, but we don't sign them. Not today. Not ever, if we have anything to say about it. 2 months later, they renewed their vows. This time it wasn't in a cold courthouse with a bored judge. It was in a small community center, decorated with flowers and ribbons. Katerina's mother flew in from overseas, nervous but excited to meet her granddaughter. David's sister stood beside them, tears of happiness running down her face. Sophie toddled down the aisle in a tiny white dress, stumbling and giggling, bringing laughter to everyone watching. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. They wrote their own vows, speaking honestly about the journey that had brought them together. David promised to continue being patient, to keep seeing her as a full person with her own dreams and struggles. Katerina promised to keep working on trust, to choose their marriage every day and to never take him for granted. When they kissed this time, it was met with cheers and applause. This was real. This was chosen. This was love built not on fantasy or desperation, but on commitment and growth and the daily choice to show up for each other. At the reception, David's construction buddies mixed with Katerina's grocery store co-workers and the other families from Sophie's daycare. Katerina's mother, who spoke almost no English, communicated through gestures and smiles with David's sister, both of them bonding over their love for Sophie. It was a celebration of not just a marriage, but of two people from completely different worlds learning to build a bridge between them. Years passed. David eventually became a construction foreman, earning better pay and working fewer hours. Katerina went back to school and became a nurse, finding purpose in caring for others the way David had cared for her. They had another child, a son they named Thomas, and Sophie became a protective big sister who bossed her little brother around lovingly. They weren't perfect. They still argued sometimes. Katerina still had moments where old fears and insecurities surfaced. David still had days where he remembered the pain of those early years and felt hurt all over again. But they had learned how to talk through problems, how to apologize sincerely, and how to choose forgiveness over resentment. Together, they started a small program in their community to help immigrant families adjust to life in America. Katerina used her own experience to counsel women who felt lost and scared in a new country. David worked with the men, helping them find jobs and teaching them practical skills. They never pretended their story was simple or perfect, but they offered it as proof that even broken beginnings could lead to beautiful destinations. On their 5th anniversary, they sat on their porch watching Sophie and Thomas play in the yard. Katerina leaned her head on David's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and trust that had become natural over the years. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked. "If I had been honest from the beginning? If we had met some other way?" David thought about it. "Sometimes. But then I realized that our story is our story. The hard parts made us who we are. I wouldn't change it even if I could, because changing it might mean losing what we have now." "That's very wise," Katerina said with a smile. "I learned it from my wife," David replied. "She taught me that love isn't always instant or easy. Sometimes it's built slowly, piece by piece, choice by choice. And sometimes that kind of love is stronger than the lightning bolt kind because you've tested it against real life and it survived." Katerina kissed his cheek. "I love you. Not because I have to, not because I need something from you, but just because you're you." "I love you too," David said, "and I would pay for you all over again if that's what it took to get to where we are now." They sat together as the sun set. Two people who had started as strangers connected only by desperation and a website, who had become partners, then parents, and finally, against all odds, each other's person. Their story wasn't the fairy tale David had once imagined when he first clicked on Katerina's profile. It was messier than that, more complicated, with scars that would never fully fade. But it was real. It was chosen. And in the end, that made it more beautiful than any fairy tale could ever be.